He's best person to be with. It makes everyone laugh, and yeah, he's got a big heart. This is for you subs.
Lotto. Who wins if you win? Rules and procedures apply. Players must be 16 or over.
LBC travel. The M25 remains closed anti-clockwise between junctions 27 at the M11 and 25 at the A10. There are severe delays still in the area. The delay on the M25 goes from junction 29 at the A127. It's especially bad, though, on the M11 southbound from the M25 to the North Circular Road, and the North Circ hardly moving at all westbound from the A12 to Arnos Grove. But all the surrounding routes like the A12 and the A13 are also suffering really badly. On the M25, there are queues anti-clockwise as well, up to junction 24 at Potters Bar, where a car's broken down, and queues of about half an hour on the M3 southbound to junction 4 at Camberley after an accident. LBC Travel, I'm Joanne Webb.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
Good morning, 4 minutes after 9 on Wednesday, August the 22nd. Now, it might seem a way away. In less than 2 years' time, we will know who the new London Mayor will be, or whether Mayor Khan is successful. But much, much sooner than that, the Conservatives, and it's fair to say, I think all parties would agree that they're going to be the prime contender to challenge. Conservatives will want to know who their candidate will be, which man or woman will go forward, and they will be announced at the Conservative Party conference, which I think is at the end of next month. And the Conservatives are whittled down to 3 potential mayoral candidates. It's quite a task when I remind all 3 of them who are in the studio with me, and I'll introduce them in just a moment, that if we look at Mayor Khan's first victory, he got just under 57% of the vote, far greater number than Boris Johnson had in his elections. In fact, you have back to the year 2000 to get a better vote, and that was obviously then Ken Livingstone, who got only just about 1% more. So there's quite a task laying ahead for, well, one of the 3 guests that I'm about to introduce. In no particular order, I want you to meet Andrew Boff, who's the GLA Conservative Assembly member. Mr. Boff, thank you for coming in.
Morning.
Next to him is Sean Bailey, who is the GLA Conservative Assembly member also. Sean, good to see you.
Morning.
Thanks very much. And Joy Morrison, who's Conservative councillor at Ealing. I don't think we've met before, but good to see you.
Very good to see you.
Thanks for coming in. Just before we take the first questions, I thought it'd be an idea for us to work out how much you know about London and the city,
This is grim.
and the city you're going to control.
So show us all up now.
So, Andrew, let's start with you. Andrew, how many tube stations, underground stations, are there in London, excluding the overground?
200 and something.
200 and something. Okay, Mr. Bailey.
Okay, yeah, 230 maybe.
230. Councillor.
I'll do 215.
215. It's 270. It's 270, so we'll allow that one.
So, Nick, I was the closest, just for the record.
When I was 16, I went to every single one.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I was a very bored teenager.
Yes. I don't know if that's something you advertise.
Yeah,
if you're trying to get votes from London. Okay. Yeah. How wide is the Thames at London Bridge in feet or metres? Mr. Bailey.
Ooh. Wide, I'd say 200 metres.
200 metres.
300 metres.
300 metres. Mr. Boff.
Yeah, 250. I don't really know.
250. 250. You're doing well, actually. 265 metres.
Wow. This is like a morning pub quiz gone
We
wrong.
move to more. I sense that we're going to be hearing from the callers some questions about crime. Mm-hmm. Let's start with you again, Andrew Boff. Mm-hmm. What's the budget for the Met Police last year?
About £3.8 billion, something like that.
£3.8 billion. Sean Bailey?
3.2 billion, I believe.
Yeah, I think Sean's right.
Joy Morrison?
With capital spend and with MOPAC, it's about a rounded $4 billion.
Okay. We get a figure of 2.5 to 3 billion, but we're all roughly in the same part. Lastly...
That's wrong.
Yeah, because it's capital.
Lastly... How many different bus franchises are there in London? Oh. Let's start. I don't know over there. Oh. Joy Morrison.
6.
Sean Bailey.
I'm going to say 56.
56,
Probably more
Mr.
accurate.
Bailey. Okay, yes. Might regret that. Yes?
It was only about 5. But...
You win on that one. It's 10. Right, the questions from me are over. It's 10 independent bus franchises. Let's go to calls first. Michelle is in Mitcham. Michelle, you're on the radio. Let's get your question. And I've decided it will go to Joy first. Joy Morrison, you'll be answering first. Go ahead, Michelle.
Hello, good morning.
Hello.
How do you feel about adopting a public health approach to the crime explosion that we're having in London at the moment?
And just so that my listeners get a sense of what you mean, a public health approach to the knife crime, or other crimes, I should say, what does that mean? In a sentence, Michelle, what does that mean to you?
Okay, so it's not just about policing, it's about youth work, it's about education, it's about social social workers, early intervention into parenting.
Okay.
It's a wraparound approach, and it starts very early.
And and I will keep you on the line for a response, but how worried are you about crime, particularly as it affects you or your family in Mitcham, Michelle?
Well, I'm terrified. I've got 2 sons, both teenagers, and I'm terrified each time they step out the house.
You are. All right, let's go first, as I said, to Joy Morrison.
Michelle, thank you so much for your question. I understand what you're feeling, and a lot of Londoners are feeling the same thing, worried about their children going to school. And what I'm advocating for as the mayoral candidate is to put a holistic approach to tackle youth violence. So I want to see a wraparound approach. I'd like to see more care for after-school clubs, more investment in psychological support in families.
What does that mean?
Well, if you look, there's an academy. I think it's called Oasis Academy, and they have a very good wraparound approach to tackle knife crime. But it helps the student in all aspects of life, not just with academics, but sort of their whole life once they leave school and coming back and everything else. And they've had a dramatic drop in knife crime. And I'd like to also empower a lot of the grassroots charities, things like Gangs United, Cracked It, that works with ex-offenders. They're doing fantastic work here in London, but they're not getting any funding, and I'd love to see them empowered.
But if I'm listening to drill music and I see my peers getting rich quick, driving BMWs, selling drugs and doing what else, why the hell would I want to go into one of these programs you just mentioned?
Well, what I think is we have to link it with employment, because you're absolutely right, Nick. It's about gangs are looked at as a way out, an economic advantage, going up, sort of almost like an apprenticeship. So we need to offer those opportunities. They don't see that they're getting the benefit from university or from going on. Yeah.
Sean Bailey.
So for me, you have to separate these two things out. People say, look, it takes a village to raise a child, but there's two ends. The end is the preventative end and how you give children resilience. So for me, I've been a youth worker for 26 odd years now. It's about family services. It's about making families stronger, having parents understand the
What if mum or dad's not interested, Mr. Bailey?
That's where the services become involved. And if you look at social services, and when you talk about a holistic approach, you must have the family in that conversation. Children,
but if dad is away and mum's not interested, you seem not to be addressing that.
You're right, Nick, but the point is this: you have to work with most children have an adult in their life who is willing to support that child. You've got to work with what you've got. That's the first thing. The other end of it as well, of course, is you have to do something about the policing.
What do you mean do something about the policing?
So I released something yesterday talking about 1,000 extra police officers, because it's hard as a child in London not to get involved in crime if it's everywhere for you. So we need the police to press down on the kind of crimes that children are involved in. I think a lot of our children carry knives out of a place of fear, so we have to make them feel like they're safe before we can have the conversations with them about how you're going to go forward, how you're going to grow. And for me, the most powerful thing is employment for your parents, employment for you, for your child of that
Where are you
age.
going to create the jobs?
We have good employment levels in London, much better than the national average.
But we've still got the crime problems.
You're right, because that's a slightly separate thing being driven by criminals. If you're talking about a holistic approach, what you're talking about is keeping young people away from that type of crime in the first place. And there's a lot of work you can do with families to give their children the resilience to avoid crime.
All right, let's get Andrew Boff into it.
What we've got to talk about, first of all, we've got to recognise that this is a public health emergency. It's getting worse and worse. We had 2 shootings in broad daylight yesterday at Rayners Lane.
And Kingsbury on Monday.
And Kingsbury on Monday. It's getting worse and worse. This is an emergency. This is not something the mayor can sit down and theorise about. He needs to take action now, and he isn't. But let's move on from him.
Yeah.
This current mayor, I'm saying.
I see, right, okay.
But first of all, we've got to realise that a lot of the things that have been mentioned aren't within the control of the GLA. We don't have a social services department that can go out and do family work. What we have, and we don't, for example, control education, but what we do have in that position as Mayor for London is the ability to pull people together, to work together in order to solve this problem. Because the only way we're going to get this solved is together. And that means... my plans are I set up a London Violence Reduction Commission. On that will be sitting the representatives of the boroughs. We're going to apply the tried and tested solutions that, for example, they used in Scotland, and we're going to apply them to London.
What did they do in Scotland?
Well, what they did is first of all, they brought all the agencies together. So social services, education, the NGOs, the voluntary organisations, and the police all sat in the same room. Too often we blame the police for this problem. problem. But blaming the police for violence is a bit like blaming the London Ambulance Service for a road accident. You know, that is not... we have to bring those agencies together. And Sean quite rightly says it does take a village to raise a child, but at the moment the village isn't being invited to help. And we need to pull those on board, and we need to use the power of the mayor to be able to get those agencies working together.
How is, briefly in a sentence, how is the current incumbent faring?
Well, he's been offered that. He's been offered that, and he's rejected it because it's all too difficult for him. So it's stuck on that very large pile of things he hasn't made a decision about. Right. Because we've got a mayor who is incapable of making decisions.
All right, Michelle, how do you respond to what you've heard?
They're all saying this good things. I'm not sure who I would trust to put them into place.
OK, well, stay tuned. We're going to go through more questions. Michelle, thanks for getting us started. Is it, Sean Bailey, is it as simple as getting more cops?
No, but it's a big part of it, because as Andrew says, we have an emergency right now. 2 shootings in broad daylight. That is not something that youth work can answer. We need to pursue those people and find them and jail them.
But that's what the police are doing, Mr. Bailey.
And they are, and they need more more leadership on that.
Well, how will it be different when you come in, though? That's what they're doing
Because
already.
The first thing is, if you look at what's going on in London, we've had a massive spike in crime. London feels dangerous now, but we've had a reduction in convictions. We are detecting less crime and convicting less crime. That's the difference I would make. It'd be really important to catch criminals on the street.
Cindy in Westminster, what's your question? Good morning.
Yeah, hi, good morning. Yes, my question is, look, crime is a big issue in the UK now, mostly in central London streets. Now, it's a lot with the drill music at the moment. When I've looked at this, and I feel that this is a major problem.
Yes.
And it plays a big part in how they're communicating to young people in order to actually carry out these crimes. And I just wondered what plans the candidates have that they can put in place to actually tackle that.
About drill music?
About the drill music.
OK, stay on the line. Andrew Boff, would you want to ban drill music?
In 1976, I was a punk, and I wore the hair and all the rest of it. And I listened to some pretty awful lyrics to some tunes. And to be honest, you know, nobody dances to the lyrics. But the drill music, you've got to understand, is a symptom of the problem. It's a symptom of that young people are using a vocabulary of violence because they think it's acceptable. They've seen violence being accepted around them as a way of communication, and that's where that music comes from. And to just attend to the symptom, I don't think is the right joined up approach. Banning music, I'd rather not.
Joy Morrison.
I mean, thank you for that, Cindy. I think the issue with the drill music, with the gangs, is very disturbing. And what I'd like to tackle is the root cause of that, the gang violence that we're seeing, the rise in that. I want to work with things like Gangs United, but I also want to take a more frontline approach with reprioritizing the police. We used to have police in high schools. We used to have a more sort of engagement. We don't anymore. I'd like to see that be brought back. I'd also... we need to...
Have we got enough officers?
We don't. But it's looking at how we can reprioritize frontline policing.
Where would you take them from?
I'd probably actually take money from MOPAC and cut MOPAC down, slim down MOPAC so that we could put more frontline policing. Because I think what's really disturbing about this drill music is you see kids doing these kind of things kind of for the bants and because they want to be the boss. And we need to create a culture where we show that this isn't acceptable. This isn't the culture that you want to be a part of. And I think we need to do this by empowering the grassroots with the charities that are already working with gangs, and then work with the police, bringing them into high schools.
Sean Bailey, should we ban drill music?
Unfortunately, it might be impossible to ban drill music because it's, you know, people are making this music in their homes. But the first practical step is to make our internet providers pull that music down as quickly as possible. There is a direct link to a drill video and then violence shortly following. So that direct link needs to be broken. That's very sure. But it goes back to culture, doesn't it? Our children will always come into contact with things they shouldn't come into contact with. We have to have ways of making sure that our children make the right choices. And that's why I say to you, when you build a holistic approach, when you talk about a public health thing, a big part of that has to be the conversations we have in our house with our children. People always talk to me about role models. The first role model should be the significant adult in your life, and we've got to help those adults have the correct conversation with their young people.
Let's see what Cindy made of the responses. Cindy?
Yeah, hi there. Yeah, I think empowering charities to educate young people is very important. And I think also having more musical events, which is what I'm trying to put together, and I'm hoping to get some support from Sean Bailey. I really think that, you know, they need to be in contact with people. Definitely the videos need to be pulled down because there's loads on YouTube. I don't see why they can't be pulled down. And a direct link is being made through these messages they're passing into one another. So, as you say, following that, then there's violence that carries out after this.
All right.
You know, and I just think that needs to be looked at because that's the way that the messages are going through.
Cindy, thank you. I want to move on. One sentence, if you would, Mr. Bailey.
Cindy, please email me at backbailey2020.com and I'll come and help you.
Okay, that's backbailey2020.com. Cindy, thank you. Neil, in Camden, your question. Go ahead.
Hi there. I'm a student in London. I was wondering what for Andrew, what his policy on legalising drugs was, and in particular cannabis.
Andrew Boff.
Certainly, I think if in some estates today in London, in many parts of London, it's easier for young people to get hold of high potency cannabis than it is for them to get hold of alcohol or tobacco. It's quicker. It's a smaller journey for them to take and less deceit in order to get it. We've got to recognise why that is because tobacco and alcohol are regulated. It means they find it more difficult. While you leave the supply of cannabis in the hands of criminal gangs who are not in the least interested in protecting the interests of young people and protecting them against not just the health effects of high potency cannabis, which can cause long-term or permanent psychological damage to young people, or their involvement in the drugs trade, protect them from their involvement in the drugs trade that has resulted in half the increase that we've seen in, for instance, half the increase we've seen in violent crime, according to the police, has been down to drugs. For as long as
are you going to decriminalise cannabis?
Well, the London Mayor hasn't got a case, but hasn't got the powers to do that. But what the London Mayor
would you push for it?
Well, I absolutely would push.
Would you push for legalisation?
Well, regulation requires legal. You cannot regulate something that's illegal.
So you would go to so you would deregulate it.
I have no power to deregulate it.
No, but you would push for it.
I would prepare the case for government and say, look, this is if you're really serious about protecting young people, if you're really serious at preventing some of those deaths that we've seen to date this year, the 44% increase in violent crime, much of that is down to the drugs trade. Now, if you would rather sit on your high horse and not address the real supply issue, that's fine. Okay. Actually, I want to save some lives.
Okay, Sean Bailey, would you look to decriminalise it?
Absolutely not. Listen.
Absolutely
not.
Not, right.
I come from a community, unfortunately, that had both ends of the drug involvement, dealing and using. I was a youth worker, and why I got into youth work is because I saw so many of my friends and the people around me whose lives had just gone to drugs. And I'm not even talking about the ones who were dangerously dealing. They were just at home smoking weed and not doing anything. And I don't see enough evidence that drug dealers will just magically disappear. If I'm a drug dealer and I can provide you with better drugs than you can buy officially, I'm still in the game, and I do that. And the real thing for me is, I just don't think I'd want to roll the dice with our young people's lives. I just don't think I'd want to take that chance. And you are risking the future of all young people if you legalise in this way. So for me, it's something I wouldn't do.
Joy Morrison.
I feel the same. I don't want to roll the dice either. I want to tackle youth violence. Let's get that under control first. Let's get the gangs and the drug trafficking under control. And if you look at cases in other countries, in the states where opiates are legal, for example, you have a huge dependency on prescription pain medication that leads to addiction. And I have a friend who died of a heroin overdose, and it was a young kid. He was in his early 20s, and had he not had access to prescription painkillers, he wouldn't have overdosed on heroin, and that's a normal kid just like you and I here in London. And so I'm very skeptical of how we go forward with this until we tackle, let's get knife crime under control, let's get the gangs under control.
I have to come back on this, because are you suggesting, for example, that William Hague is rolling the dice, that the British Medical Journal is rolling the dice, that the Police Federation are rolling the dice? Because all those sources have recommended a fundamental reform which includes the regulation of cannabis. They aren't taking the young people's lives at risk. The people who are risking young people's lives, who are trying the same tried and tested solutions before that have failed, and you are not going to get that under control unless you address some of the root problems of why young people are resorting to violence and why young people are dying.
Who are you directing
on
this to?
our
Who are you directing this to?
Both, because
Sean,
both use that phrase.
Let me say this to you, Nick. Right, I'm suggesting that those people don't know what it's like to live in London on an estate with that being your only income. The idea that drug dealers will magically disappear, for me, just doesn't work.
That wasn't suggested.
But yes, it is, because you're saying by legalising and regulating, you'll be able to get access to drugs. But if you can get somebody who can provide you with more powerful drugs, more cheaply,
look at the evidence in Portugal. Look at the evidence in the states of the United Kingdom. Look at the evidence from Canada, who are currently legalising, putting in place regulations to legalise drugs. And the objective in Canada, the reason they're doing it in Canada, is to restrict the access that young people have to substances that can harm them.
We must move on. We must move on to other questions. I must take some from the emails. This comes from Benito in Fulham. What would the respective candidates' policies be regarding cycle lanes and cycle superhighways? Sean Bailey?
I think for me, I'm a cyclist. I like a bit of cycling to and from the station. I used to race BMXs when I was a kid. But I think there's two things. For me, I want more people to get involved in cycling. So I think you need to look at quiet ways. And currently, the way in which the City Hall deals with local authorities around quiet ways is terrible. And we could do more to get more people cycling.
You want more cycle lanes?
No, more people cycling. When you talk about cycle lanes, the real weakness is consultation. In some places, they're hugely popular. In other places, they're hated with a passion. And I believe because the consultation around the cycle superhighways has been poor. So if you're going to,
has the one on the embankment worked?
If you ask people who use the embankment,
I'm asking you.
No, it hasn't. It's really added to the traffic up there.
So would you? I mean, it's being pulled up, isn't it, next year anyway? So the new drains have to go in. Would you have put it back?
I would have looked at even putting it in the first place and how close it is, how much of the road space it takes, because the thing is, you definitely want to protect cyclists, but we need to look at the routes and what effect it has on traffic in London.
I'd like to have a better and sort of more joined up cycle lanes across London, so sort of through working with the councils more closely so that it's a joined up route throughout all of London. I'm really interested in family cycling. We're encouraged to take our children to school each day, but actually it's very difficult. It's often very dangerous.
Clearly you want more cycle lanes in London then.
Well, I'd like to see it accessible more for families. I think it's very difficult for families to actually take their children by,
if we look at the heart of London, say what they've done in the embankment in other areas, do you support those cycle lanes?
I think we need to have a joined up approach.
What does that mean?
It means looking at TfL of how we can best move traffic through central London, making sure that nothing is causing extra congestion.
But they have, haven't they, those cycle lanes?
I think there's more that could be done. I think there's more consultation that could be done. I think that we could actually have a more joined up approach throughout London.
But the problem is not the consultation, it's the listening. And in so many of these cycle superhighways, reasonable suggestions by local residents have been rejected out of hand by a TfL that finds it incapable of listening to what people are actually saying. If you take, for example, things like CS9 and CS11, whereby there's been reasonable suggestions from local residents to amend it, and they've just been rejected. Now, and what that's effectively done is it's made the drive towards increasing the number of cyclists. Well, people have fallen out of favour with that objective because of the attitude of TfL. So we definitely need to listen to more residents saying. We need to amend our plans in order to take account of what residents are saying, because fundamentally, if you talk to residents, they think it's a good idea. They absolutely think it's a good idea that more people should cycle. Right. Those shorter routes as well need to be a priority.
All right, James in Sidcup, you're through. Go ahead, James, you're on the radio. What's your question? Good morning.
Good morning, and good morning to candidates. I'm 40 years in housing and development, and I doubt very much that any of the candidates will disagree that the biggest crisis in London is a housing crisis. And the fact of the matter is, my suggestion is, and when I've for several years now been calling for a housing summit, which I hope may be called during the next election. The fact of the matter is this: we're 10 years behind. Bear in mind, I do this for a living. We're over 10 years.
I've got to move you to your question. What is your question, James?
Okay. Well, we will not meet the housing targets in the next 10 years. So we need short-term solutions. So I'm asking the candidates whether they will agree that we need to deal with the private rented sector. We need to regulate it as we do housing associations and councils.
And regulate it how?
Through a licensing and registering system.
Wow, that sounds expensive. I'll come back to you in a moment. Start with you, Sean Bailey.
So listen, I'm a Londoner who's chased cheap rent all over the place. I've lived even north, south and west because of it. I do have great sympathy with controlling rogue landlords, poor landlords in London.
You think they should be licensed?
Yes, to a certain extent I do. I don't think we can provide people with secure tenancies until we get hold of landlords.
Should there be rent capping?
No, rent capping absolutely doesn't work. Just look at the experiences they've had in New York and other places around the world. But when you talk about easing the burden on renters in London, there's two things. Obviously, you want to try and keep the prices down as best you can by having as big a market you can, but also as well, you want to give people secure, longer-term tenancies. That's what people are really after.
And should they, London, do as New Zealand has done and ban the sale of homes to foreigners?
No, we are an open city.
So let Chinese people come in and buy all these.
Listen,
you agree?
Yes, because we need London. One of London's real powers.
And then they charge high rent.
Yeah, is its internationalism, and we need finance in our London system to build houses of every description. So banning foreign finance, just to me, it just
Joy Morrison,
would
would you ban them? Sales to foreigners?
I would like to look at how we can restrict so that we give special privileges to Londoners buying London properties. Too many, I think, of our properties are going to overseas investors.
But some of these are hugely wealthy Chinese and Russians by individuals and organisations.
Yes.
Way beyond them of any. So it wouldn't make any difference, would it?
But I think it would, because it's all driving up the lack of supply that we have in London. Each house that's sitting empty is a house that could be used for a family. Say, turning that whole thing into a temporary accommodation, or that is a whole house that's going to waste because someone wants to sit on it.
Seize vacant properties.
Well, I don't want to seize it, but if you look at Germany does have a policy where they don't allow properties to sit vacant for huge amounts of time.
What's huge?
Well, it used to be 6 months. I have to look and see if it's changed, but it's to allow for properties to be utilised by the local authority.
So a property is empty for 6 months on a day, and the local authority seizes it, does it?
Well, I think if you look in, let's say, any of the local authorities, you have properties that are standing idle for years and years and years on end, and the time it takes for compulsory purchase is astronomical.
Should there be rent caps?
What I'd like to see is I just would like to see an injection of more private rented properties. I'd like to see pension funds working with local authorities and with public-owned land, so there's public-private partnerships.
No rent caps?
No, I'd like to create more influx of supply. So we'd increase the supply of secure, high-quality rented accommodation.
Andrew Boff, let's come back to James's question about licensing. Yes. Would you be a fan of that?
Well, no, not really, because licensing doesn't actually do anything. Licensing ends up being a register of honest people, and it's the honest people who are doing all right. They're
abiding by the laws.
They're providing homes for people in London. It's the people who are not going to register, who are not going to be licensed, that we've got to have a problem about. And we come up with all these new schemes that they're all around. There's always been a power for local authorities to be able to effectively take over properties that are empty. Right. They've been around for ages. Licensing has been around for ages, but these licensing have typically been used by local authorities who for years have neglected all those powers and neglected their residents. They haven't looked for beds in sheds. They haven't used the powers that they've got to clean to ensure that there's fit standards of accommodation. And so as Mayor for London, I'm going to make sure that those local authorities are named and shamed, because there's some pretty awful examples of mainly Labour authorities, may I say, who are not looking after the interests of their.
You're going to have a couple of questions from me now, and I must, because we have actually reached the end of the half hour. I know it's moved at an incredible speed, but a couple of questions from me to each of you. Sean Bailey, start first with you. How Islamophobic is the Conservative Party?
I don't think the Conservative Party is Islamophobic. I've been in the party for a long time now.
Was Boris Johnson's remarks right?
I'm a defender of free speech. I think you should be able to say things. You should be able to offend and have.
Is the burqa ridiculous?
I wouldn't have used the words he used, but he's under investigation.
Yeah. Would you ban it?
No, like Boris said, I believe it must be a choice for that woman. If a woman wants to wear that, that's her choice to make, I believe.
Joy Morrison, how Islamophobic is the party you're a member of?
I don't think it's Islamophobia at all. I mean, I think it's really inviting. Look at me, I'm an immigrant. I came here with nothing.
I figured from your voice. I kind of got that.
Where did you come from?
How wise were the words employed by Boris Johnson in his column?
I think we can all learn to be more careful with what we say, but I think I'm a supporter of free speech, but I'm also a supporter of people being able to practice their religious freedoms however they want.
Should he have apologised when he was asked to?
I don't think so.
No?
I mean, I think...
Andrew Boff, should Boris Johnson have apologised when the party chairman suggested he might?
Yeah, of course.
Why?
Well, because
it's free speech, isn't it?
Yeah, of course it's free
speech. You just said he had to apologise, so did he have to apologise?
I didn't say should he have. Should he have? If it were me, I would have.
Right.
Right. So what we're getting to here is Boris maintained the argument that people who were wearing burqas were forced to do so and therefore victims. That's an argument that's out there. He then mocked those people who were using those, who were made to, who in his argument were made to wear that. Now, I think that's a mistake. I would have liked to have apologised. We live in a free country. We can say what we like, and it's my freedom to challenge people.
Final question to you all. There's concern, apparently, about Theresa May and her 100,000 net migration target after Brexit. Is the Prime Minister wrong, Andrew?
I think net targets are ridiculous.
So she is wrong?
Yeah, I think so.
Sean Bailey?
I think something to aim for. I think it's going to be a tough thing to
No, is it right to set a target of 100,000?
They never work.
Well, yes, set the target, work towards it. It's something to aim to. But the thing I will say...
No, at least Andrew Boff... No. So Andrew Boff is absolutely... Yes, she is wrong. You agree, she's wrong.
No, I said, yes, set the target, work towards it. So, yes, it's a good thing. Have the target, work towards it.
Is she right or wrong to
she's
have a
right, she's right, Nick.
She's right to have a target of 100,000.
I said, yes, set the target. But the key thing is this. We in London need a talent pipeline, so we must not affect that. That's the thing we...
Joy Morrison, setting a target of 100,000, right or wrong?
We live in hope.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
I mean, let's hope for that. That sounds great, but let's see.
Yeah. All right, and with the conversation can continue in the room. Andrew Boff, who you can hear chuntering away, Sean Bailey as well. Joy Morrison, it's been a pleasure. Well, not meeting you because I've met a couple of you before. Thank you very much. This is LBC. Simon Conway has the news.
The three people hoping to become the Conservative candidate for London Mayor have clashed over how to tackle youth violence in a debate here on LBC. Andrew Boff, Joy Morrison and Sean Bailey were asked whether they think drill music should be banned.
To just attend to the symptom, I don't think is the right joined up approach.
I want to work with things like Gangs United, but I also want to take a